George Strait secretly visits the house where he was born. Inside, he finds a letter from the past that changes everything. The roar of 60,000 voices still echoed in George Strait's ears as he stood alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The King of Country had just delivered another flawless performance at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, his 60th #1 hit still ringing through the massive stadium. At 72 years old, he should have felt on top of the world. Instead, an inexplicable emptiness gnawed at his chest like a persistent ache that no amount of applause could heal. He loosened his signature black tie and removed his white cowboy hat, running weathered fingers through his silver hair. The face looking back at him showed every one of his 7 decades, laugh lines carved deep from years of genuine smiles. But tonight, those same eyes held something different, a longing he couldn't quite name. "Another sold-out show, George." His manager burst through the door, clipboard in hand and phone already ringing. "The press wants interviews about the new tour dates, and we've got 3 more venues calling about—" "Cancel everything for tomorrow," George interrupted quietly, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority that had commanded stages for 5 decades. His manager froze mid-sentence. "Cancel? But George, we have the radio interview with—" "I said cancel everything." George's tone wasn't harsh, just final. "I need some time." The older man nodded reluctantly and backed out of the room, leaving George alone with his thoughts. Something was pulling at him tonight, something deeper than the usual post-show melancholy. Maybe it was turning 72 last month, or perhaps it was the anniversary of his brother Buddy's passing approaching. Whatever it was, George felt an overwhelming urge to reconnect with something real, something beyond the glittering lights and endless crowds. Hey there, music lovers. If you're enjoying this story about the King of Country himself, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love hearing from fans around the world, and your support means everything to us. What do you think George is feeling right now? Drop your thoughts below. 3 hours later, George sat in his truck in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner just outside San Antonio, scrolling through his phone. He wasn't sure what had driven him to search for Poteet, Texas real estate at 2 in the morning, but there it was on his screen, a listing that made his heart skip a beat. The small white farmhouse where he'd spent the first 18 years of his life was for sale. The photograph on the realtor's website showed the same wraparound porch where he used to sit with his father John, listening to Hank Williams on an old radio while they worked on farm equipment. The same oak tree where his mother Doris had hung a tire swing that he and Buddy had fought over countless summer afternoons. The same red barn where he'd first picked up a guitar and dreamed of something bigger than their small Texas town. George's thumb hovered over the contact number for Frank Porter, the listing agent. What was he thinking? He was George Strait. He could buy a dozen houses without blinking. But this wasn't about money. This was about something he'd lost along the way to stardom, something he desperately needed to find again. Without allowing himself to overthink it, he dialed the number. "Porter Real Estate, this is Frank," came a gruff voice after 4 rings. "Hi, I saw your listing for the property on Cedar Street in Poteet, the white farmhouse. I was wondering if I could take a look at it tomorrow." There was a pause, followed by an exaggerated sigh. "Look, buddy, I'll be straight with you. That place has been sitting on the market for 8 months. It needs work, a lot of work. The foundation's settling, the roof needs replacing, and don't even get me started on the plumbing." "You sure you want to waste your time?" Frank's dismissive tone ignited something protective in George's chest. "Yes, I'm sure. What time works for you? I suppose I could squeeze you in around 10. What's your name?" George hesitated for just a moment. George Smith." "All right, Mr. Smith, don't say I didn't warn you about the condition of the place. The last owners abandoned it back in the 70s when the son went off to the army and never came back. Left it to rot, if you ask me. Some people have no respect for property." George's knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. Those last owners Frank was bad-mouthing so casually were his own parents. His father John had kept that house in perfect condition until his arthritis made it impossible to maintain the large property alone. They hadn't abandoned it. They'd been forced to sell it and move to a smaller place in town when the farm became too much for aging bodies to handle. "I'll see you at 10, George managed through gritted teeth, ending the call before he said something he'd regret. The next morning found George standing in front of Porter Real Estate, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, aviator sunglasses, and the most unremarkable clothes he could find in his closet. He'd deliberately chosen his oldest truck, the beat-up Ford he used around his ranch, hoping to blend in as just another potential buyer. Frank Porter turned out to be exactly what George had imagined from their phone conversation, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and the kind of aggressive handshake that was meant to establish dominance. His polo shirt stretched tight across his belly, and he wore the practiced smile of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "You must be Smith," Frank said, looking George up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "I gotta tell you again, this place is gonna need serious money to make it livable. The previous owners just walked away from it like it was nothing. No pride in ownership, you know what I mean?" George nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to speak as they walked toward the house. Every word out of Frank's mouth felt like a personal insult to his family's memory. The farmhouse looked smaller than George remembered, but the bones were still good. The white paint was peeling, and the porch sagged slightly on one side, but the structure itself seemed solid. His mother's flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and the tire swing hung motionless from the oak tree, its rope frayed and weathered. "Like I said, it's going to be a money pit," Frank continued as he fumbled with the lockbox. "The family that lived here, the Straits, they just up and left everything behind when their boy went off to war or whatever. Never even came back to clean out their junk. We had to haul out decades worth of garbage just to make it showable." George's heart clenched. That junk Frank had thrown away was his family's history, photographs, furniture that had been passed down through generations, his mother's china set that she'd saved for special occasions that never seemed important enough. The front door creaked open on rusty hinges, and George stepped across the threshold into his childhood. The smell hit him first, that particular combination of old wood, dust, and something indefinably familiar that he couldn't place. The living room looked cavernous without furniture, but he could still see the ghost of Christmas mornings past, could almost hear his mother calling him and Buddy down for breakfast. Frank was still talking, pointing out water stains on the ceiling and loose floorboards, but George barely heard him. He was lost in memories of learning to play guitar in that corner by the window, of helping his father count cattle from the kitchen table, of family dinners where his parents shared stories of their own childhoods. "The worst part is upstairs," Frank was saying as they climbed the narrow staircase that George had run up and down thousands of times. "There's still a bunch of old trash in the attic that nobody wanted to deal with, probably just moldy clothes and worthless papers. We'll have it all hauled to the dump before closing, of course." They reached the second floor, and George found himself standing in the doorway of his childhood bedroom. The walls were still pale blue, though now water-stained and peeling. This was where he'd written his first song, where he'd practiced guitar until his fingers bled, where he'd dreamed of stages and spotlights while staring at the ceiling on countless sleepless nights. "The attic access is right there," Frank pointed to a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. "Like I said, just a bunch of junk the previous owners were too lazy to clean out. Some people have no consideration for others, you know." George couldn't take it anymore. Every dismissive comment about his family's junk and trash felt like a knife to his chest, but something Frank had said caught his attention. There were still belongings in the attic, things his family had left behind. "Would it be possible for me to take a look at what's up there?" George asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "I'm interested in the history of the place. Old houses fascinate me." Frank rolled his eyes. "Knock yourself out, but don't blame me when you come down covered in dust and spiderwebs. I'll wait downstairs. My back can't handle climbing into attics anymore." As Frank's footsteps retreated down the stairs, George stood alone in the hallway of his childhood home. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the attic ladder. Whatever was up there had been left by his family over 50 years ago. His parents were gone now, as was his brother Buddy. This might be his last chance to connect with pieces of his past that he'd thought were lost forever. The ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed into the dim attic space. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a small window, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, George could make out several boxes, and what looked like an old trunk pushed against the far wall. His heart pounded as he made his way across the creaky floorboards, careful to step only on the joists. The first box contained old clothes, his father's work shirts, his mother's Sunday dresses, garments that still held the faint scent of the people he'd loved and lost. Tears threatened as he carefully folded a flannel shirt he remembered his father wearing on cold mornings. The second box held photograph albums, their pages yellow with age. George found himself looking at pictures of his parents as young newlyweds, himself as a baby, family gatherings with relatives whose names he'd forgotten. There was one photograph that stopped him cold. His parents standing on the front porch with a young girl who looked to be about 8 years old. George studied the image intently. The girl had the same eyes as his mother, the same stubborn jawline as his father, but George had never seen her before in his life. With shaking hands, he set the photograph aside and moved toward the old trunk. The wood was dark with age, and brass corners had turned green with oxidation. As he lifted the heavy lid, a musty smell wafted up, carrying with it the weight of decades. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were more photographs, some sheet music, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope that made George's blood run cold. Written across the front in his father's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "For George, to be opened only if something happens to me." George's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and yellowed, the wax seal still intact after all these years. His father had died 15 years ago, and George had never known this letter existed. What secrets had John Strait felt important enough to hide away in this dusty attic? From downstairs, he could hear Frank's impatient voice calling up. "You find anything interesting up there, Smith? Because I've got another showing at noon, and I'd like to wrap this up." George slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, along with the mysterious photograph. Whatever revelations that letter contained, he wasn't going to discover them with Frank Porter hovering nearby. He quickly closed the trunk and made his way back to the ladder, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. As he climbed down from the attic, George realized that his simple, nostalgic visit to his childhood home had just become something much more complicated. The envelope in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, and the image of the unknown girl haunted his thoughts. Who was she? And what secret had his father felt compelled to preserve in that sealed letter? One thing was certain. George Strait's understanding of his own family history was about to change forever. "Just some old family photos and clothes," George called down to Frank, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil raging inside him. "Nothing valuable." Frank's heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs as he climbed back up. "See? I told you it was just junk. The previous owners left all kinds of worthless stuff behind. We should have hauled it all to the dump years ago." George bit his tongue hard enough to taste blood. Every casual insult about his family's belongings felt like a physical blow, but he couldn't reveal his true identity. Not yet. Not until he understood what secrets that envelope contained. "I'd like to take a few more minutes to look around if that's okay," George said, forcing a polite smile. "Maybe walk through the rooms alone to get a feel for the space." Frank checked his watch with obvious irritation. "Look, Mr. Smith, I've got 3 more showings today, and honestly, I don't think this place is right for you. It's going to cost more to fix up than it's worth, and the location isn't exactly prime real estate. Why don't I show you some other properties that might be more suitable for your budget?" The condescending tone in Frank's voice made George's jaw clench. The assumption that he couldn't afford the property, the dismissive attitude toward the house where he'd grown up, it all combined to create a burning anger in his chest. But he needed time alone to read that letter. "I appreciate your concern, but I'd really like to spend a few more minutes here. Could you perhaps wait outside? I promise I won't be long." Frank's expression shifted to barely concealed annoyance. "Fine, 10 minutes, but then we really need to move on." He headed toward the stairs, muttering under his breath about time wasters and tire kickers. George waited until he heard the front door slam before pulling the envelope from his pocket with trembling hands. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if the secrets inside had given it extra gravity. His father's handwriting looked exactly as he remembered, neat, precise, the product of an 8th-grade education, but a lifetime of careful thought. He carefully broke the wax seal, and the brittle paper cracked slightly as he unfolded it. The letter was dated March 15, 1971, just 2 weeks before George had shipped out for basic training. His father had written this while George was still living at home, preparing for his military service, completely unaware that life-changing secrets were being committed to paper just feet away from where he slept. "My dear son, George," the letter began, and just seeing those words in his father's handwriting brought tears to his eyes. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way back to this house. I pray that what I'm about to tell you will help you understand why some things in our family were never spoken about, and why your mother and I made the choices we did." George's hands shook as he continued reading, his father's voice seeming to speak directly to him across the decades. First, you must know that our real family name is not Strait. We were born McKinneys, and your grandfather was Samuel McKinney, not Samuel Strait, as you've always believed. We changed our name when we came to Texas in 1948, and we had good reason to do so. George had to sit down on the dusty floor, his legs suddenly weak. His entire identity, the name that had become synonymous with country music royalty, wasn't even real. Your grandfather Samuel was not just a farmer, as we told you. He was a gifted songwriter who composed music for some of the biggest names in country music during the 1940s. He wrote under different names, selling his songs for cash because he needed money to support his family during the Depression. Some of those songs became huge hits, but Samuel never got the credit or the royalties he deserved. The letter continued, and George felt the world shifting beneath him as he read on. In 1947, Samuel witnessed something he shouldn't have seen. He was delivering some new songs to a recording studio in Nashville when he overheard a conversation between powerful men in the music industry. They were discussing how they had been stealing songs from unknown writers like your grandfather, changing a few words and claiming full ownership. When they realized Samuel had heard them, they threatened his life and the lives of his family. George's mind raced as he tried to process this information. His grandfather had been threatened by music industry executives, the same industry that had made George one of the wealthiest entertainers in America. We had no choice but to run. Samuel gathered up all his original compositions. There were hundreds of them, George. Songs that could have made him famous if the world had been different. We changed our name to Strait, sold everything we owned, and moved to Texas, where we thought we could disappear and start over. The next paragraph made George's heart stop completely. There's something else you need to know, son. You have a sister. Her name is Eleanor, and she was born 2 years before you. When we were running from those men in Nashville, your mother was pregnant with you, and we were also caring for 2-year-old Eleanor. The stress and fear of our situation caused complications with your mother's pregnancy, and the doctor told us she might not survive having another child so soon. George's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. A sister? He had a sister he'd never known about. A kind family in Nashville, the Hendersons, offered to adopt Eleanor temporarily until we could get settled and send for her. They were good people, musicians themselves, and they promised to love her like their own daughter until we could reunite our family. But when you were born, your mother became very ill, and it took years for her to recover. By the time we were stable enough to bring Eleanor home, the Hendersons had moved away and we lost track of them. George could barely breathe as he continued reading through his tears. Your mother and I searched for Eleanor for decades, George. We hired private investigators, contacted adoption agencies, reached out to every Henderson we could find, but it was as if she had vanished completely. The guilt of losing her has haunted us every day of our lives. We never told you about her because we kept hoping we would find her and bring her home before you ever had to know about our failure as parents. The letter went on to explain that Samuel's original compositions were hidden somewhere in the house, along with documentation proving his authorship of songs that had become classics. John Strait had kept everything, hoping that someday the truth could come out and their family name could be cleared. The songs are hidden in a place only family would think to look, the letter continued, behind the loose board in the kitchen wall, the one you and Buddy used to hide your slingshots behind when you thought you were in trouble. Your grandfather's entire life's work is there, waiting for someone with the power and influence to bring his story to light. George wiped his eyes and looked at the photograph he'd found earlier with new understanding. The little girl in the picture wasn't a cousin or family friend. She was his sister Eleanor, captured in one of the last photographs taken before the family had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. I know this is a lot to bear, son, the letter concluded, but I believe you have the strength to handle the truth and perhaps the means to right some old wrongs. If you choose to search for Eleanor, know that she would be about 74 years old now, and her adopted name would be Eleanor Henderson. She may not even know she was adopted, or she may have spent her whole life wondering about the family she lost. The letter was signed simply, "With all my love and pride, your father, John McKinney Strait." George sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the letter trembling in his hands. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his name, his heritage, it was all built on a foundation of secrets and survival. His grandfather had been a songwriter whose work had been stolen by the very industry that had made George famous. He had a sister somewhere in the world who might not even know he existed. The sound of Frank's voice calling from outside snapped George back to reality. "Mister," "Smith, time's up, I've got another appointment." George carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket, along with the photograph. His hands were still shaking as he made his way downstairs, but his mind was crystal clear for the first time in months. He knew exactly what he had to do. Frank was standing by his car, clearly irritated and ready to leave. "So what do you think? Ready to look at some other properties that might be more realistic for your situation?" George pulled off his sunglasses and looked Frank directly in the eyes. "Actually, I think this house is perfect. I'd like to make an offer." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Smith, I really don't think you understand the scope of work this place needs. The asking price is $350,000, but by the time you factor in all the repairs—" "I'll pay the full asking price," George interrupted. "Cash. No inspection, no contingencies." Frank's mouth fell open. "Cash? Are you serious?" "Dead serious." George pulled out his phone and scrolled to his banker's contact. "I can have the funds transferred today if you can expedite the paperwork." For the first time since they'd met, Frank looked at George with something approaching respect. "Well, that's certainly generous. May I ask what changed your mind?" George looked back at the house where he'd grown up, where his family had kept their secrets, where his grandfather's stolen legacy lay hidden behind a kitchen wall. "Let's just say, this place has more history than I initially realized." As Frank fumbled with his phone to call his office, George felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just buying his childhood home, he was reclaiming his family's story. And somewhere out there, a 74-year-old woman named Eleanor Henderson might be about to discover that she wasn't alone in the world after all. But first, George had to retrieve his grandfather's hidden compositions and figure out how to expose the truth about an industry conspiracy that had been buried for over 70 years. The King of Country was about to embark on the most important performance of his life, not on a stage, but in the pursuit of justice for a family legacy that powerful people had tried to erase. The house deal could wait a few more hours. George had some loose floorboards to investigate. 20 minutes later, George stood alone in the kitchen of his childhood home, having convinced Frank to give him time to think about the offer, while the realtor rushed off to his next appointment. The moment Frank's car disappeared down the dusty road, George had slipped back inside. Using the spare key he remembered his mother always kept under the ceramic frog by the back door, a hiding spot that apparently hadn't changed in 50 years. The kitchen looked smaller than he remembered, stripped of the warm yellow curtains his mother had sewn and the oak table where the family had shared thousands of meals. But the bones of the room were exactly the same, including the wall where he and Buddy had hidden their contraband slingshots whenever they'd broken a window or knocked over one of their mother's flower pots. George knelt beside the wall and ran his fingers along the baseboards, searching for the loose board his father had mentioned in the letter. At first, everything felt solid, but then his fingertips found a section where the wood gave slightly under pressure. Using his pocket knife, he carefully pried at the edges until a foot-long section of baseboard came away, revealing a dark cavity behind the wall. His heart hammered as he reached into the space, his fingers encountering the edge of what felt like a metal box. It took some maneuvering to work it free, but eventually he pulled out a rectangular tin that had once held Christmas cookies. He remembered his mother filling it with homemade sugar cookies every December. Now it contained something far more precious than holiday treats. George sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and carefully opened the tin. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and rubber bands, were dozens of sheets of yellowed paper covered in musical notations and lyrics written in a careful, flowing hand. His grandfather's compositions, preserved for over 70 years in their hiding place. As George examined the sheets, his eyes widened with recognition. The top page contained a song called Your Cheatin' Heart, but the composer listed was Samuel McKinney, not Hank Williams. The date on the manuscript was January 1952, a full year before Hank Williams had recorded what became one of his biggest hits. George's hands trembled as he shuffled through more sheets. Cold, Cold Heart, another Hank Williams classic, was there with Samuel McKinney's name as composer. Hey Good Lookin' was there too, along with dozens of other songs that George recognized as country standards, all bearing his grandfather's name and predating their famous recorded versions by months or years. At the bottom of the tin was a leather journal filled with his grandfather's handwriting. George opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble at his touch. The first entry was dated March 3, 1947. Delivered 6 new songs to Acuff Rose Publishing today. Fred Rose seemed pleased with them, especially the one I'm calling Your Cheatin' Heart. He said it had potential to be something special. Payment was $25 per song. Not much, but it'll help put food on the table and maybe new shoes for little Eleanor. George flipped through more entries, each one documenting his grandfather's interactions with music publishers, recording studios, and industry executives. The picture that emerged was of a talented but naive songwriter who trusted the wrong people and paid dearly for his innocence. The entry that made George's blood run cold was dated November 15th, 1947. Something terrible happened today. I went to a Cuff Rose to deliver my latest batch of songs, but I arrived earlier than expected. The office door was slightly open, and I could hear Fred Rose talking to someone about that McKinney fellow and how easy it was to buy songs from him for practically nothing, then claim authorship and collect all the royalties. They were laughing about how I was so grateful for any payment that I never asked questions about publishing rights or songwriter credits. The journal continued. Then I heard them discussing other writers they were cheating the same way. They called us hayseeds and rubes who didn't understand the music business. When I tried to leave quietly, the floorboard creaked, and they realized someone had been listening. Fred Rose came to the door and saw me standing there. The look in his eyes was pure hatred and threat. George's hands shook as he read the final entries, which detailed his grandfather's growing fear, as mysterious men began showing up at the family farm, asking questions about Samuel's whereabouts and making veiled threats about what happened to people who caused trouble for important music industry figures. The last entry was heartbreaking. We have to run. Eleanor is only 2 years old, and Doris is pregnant again. I can't let my family suffer for my mistakes. I should never have trusted those men. Should never have signed those papers without understanding what they meant. My songs, my life's work, they've stolen it all, but at least I can keep my family safe. George closed the journal and sat in stunned silence. His grandfather hadn't just been cheated. He'd been systematically robbed by some of the most powerful figures in country music history. Songs that had made millions of dollars and launched legendary careers had been stolen from a simple Texas farmer who just wanted to feed his family. The sound of a car door slamming outside snapped George back to the present. Through the kitchen window, he could see Frank Porter walking back toward the house, looking irritated and impatient. George quickly rewrapped the manuscripts and journal, returning them to their hiding place for now. He would need time to properly examine everything and figure out how to proceed. "Mr. Smith," Frank called as he approached the back door. "What are you doing inside? I thought I locked this place up." George met Frank at the door, his mind racing to come up with an explanation. "The back door was open when I walked around the house. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to get a better feel for the kitchen layout." Frank frowned and pushed past George into the kitchen. "That door should have been locked. I specifically checked it before we left." He examined the doorframe, then looked suspiciously at George. "Are you sure you didn't—" "I'm sure," George interrupted, his tone carrying just enough authority to discourage further questions. "Now about my offer. I meant what I said about paying cash. How quickly can we close?" Frank's suspicious expression melted into dollar signs. "Well, if you're serious about cash with no contingencies, we could probably close within a week. But Mr. Smith, I have to ask, what exactly do you do for a living? This is a significant cash purchase for someone I've never heard of." George almost smiled at the irony. Here was Frank Porter, a small-town real estate agent, questioning the financial capacity of one of the highest-earning entertainers in American history. "I'm in the music business," George said simply. "Oh, a musician?" Frank's tone suggested he thought even less of George's financial prospects now. "Well, I hope you understand that being a musician and actually having the funds to close on a house are two very different things. I'll need proof of funds before we can proceed." The condescending attitude was the final straw. George had endured Frank's dismissive comments about his family, his casual disrespect for the house's history, and his assumption that George couldn't afford the property. But questioning his financial credibility, while standing in the house where his family had been driven from their home by industry corruption, was too much. George pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, then turned the screen toward Frank. The account balance showed 8 figures, more money than Frank Porter would see in several lifetimes. Frank's eyes widened as he stared at the screen, his mouth falling open in shock. How did you—" "I told you I'm in the music business," George said quietly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Now, would you like to discuss the closing timeline, or do you have more questions about my ability to pay? Frank stammered, his entire demeanor shifting as he realized he'd been talking down to someone who could probably buy his entire real estate agency without thinking twice about it. No questions at all, Mr. Smith. I apologize if I seemed... we get a lot of dreamers who waste our time, and I just wanted to... I understand, George said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But Frank, I need to ask you something. When you said the previous owners left junk behind that you had to clean out, what exactly did you throw away? Frank looked confused by the question. Oh, just the usual stuff people abandon. Old furniture, boxes of papers, some broken farming equipment. Nothing valuable. Why do you ask? Those papers you threw away, did you look through them? Were there any documents that might have had historical value? Frank shrugged dismissively. Historical value? Mr. Smith, the family that lived here were just simple farmers. The man was a crop duster, and his wife cleaned houses in town. What kind of historical documents would people like that have? George felt his jaw clench again. John Strait had worked multiple jobs to support his family after they'd lost everything fleeing Nashville. He'd been a crop duster, a mechanic, a part-time ranch hand. Whatever it took to put food on the table after his father's music career had been destroyed by thieves in expensive suits. You'd be surprised what ordinary families accumulate over the years, George said carefully. Old letters, photographs, maybe even business documents. When did you have the clean-out done? Oh, that was years ago when we first got the listing. Had to make 3 trips to the dump to haul everything away. The previous owner's son never came back to claim anything after the old folks died, so we just assumed it was all garbage. George's heart sank. How many family photographs, letters, and memories had Frank carelessly discarded? How many pieces of his family's story were now buried in some Texas landfill? The son you mentioned, George pressed. Do you know what happened to him? Frank's expression grew thoughtful. Funny you should ask. I was just thinking about that this morning when I saw something in the news. You know who George Strait is, right? The country singer. George nodded, not trusting his voice. Well, there was something on the radio about him having a concert in San Antonio last night. Got me thinking about the coincidence, you know? The family that used to live here, their last name was Strait too. Same spelling and everything. Of course, it couldn't be the same family. The George Strait that lived here was just some farm boy who went off to the army and never came back. Nothing like that famous singer. George stared at Frank, realizing that the man who had spent the morning insulting his family and throwing away their belongings had no idea he was talking to the very person he was discussing. The irony was almost too much to bear. That is quite a coincidence, George managed. Right, though I suppose Strait isn't that uncommon a name in Texas. Anyway, about the closing. Should I have my office draw up the contracts? George was about to respond when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his manager's number, and George realized he'd been gone much longer than planned. His absence would be noticed soon, and questions would be asked. Excuse me for just a moment, George said, stepping outside to answer the call. George, where the hell are you? His manager's voice was frantic. You missed the radio interview. The record label has been calling non-stop, and there are rumors flying that you've disappeared. Please tell me you're not having some kind of breakdown. George looked back at the house where he'd grown up, where his family's secrets had been hidden for decades, where a small-town real estate agent had unknowingly insulted the king of country music to his face while standing in his childhood home. I'm fine, George said quietly. But I need you to clear my schedule for the next few days. Something important has come up. Clear your schedule. George, you have obligations. You can't just... Clear it, George repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built an empire on his own terms. And send our attorney to Poteet, Texas. I'm buying a house and I want the deal closed immediately. As George ended the call, he realized his quiet return to his roots was about to become much more complicated. Frank Porter was about to discover exactly who he'd been dealing with, and George was about to begin a journey that would challenge everything the music industry thought it knew about its own history. The king of country was coming home, and he was bringing the truth with him. As George pocketed his phone and turned back toward the house, he noticed Frank standing in the doorway with a strange expression on his face. The realtor was holding his own phone, and his eyes kept darting between the screen and George with growing recognition. Mr. Smith, Frank said slowly, his voice uncertain. I just got a call from my office. They said someone named George Strait's attorney contacted them about expediting a house purchase in Petite. They wanted to know if we had any properties that might interest a celebrity client. George's stomach dropped. He'd hoped to maintain his anonymity a little longer, at least until he could retrieve his grandfather's manuscripts and figure out his next move. But his manager's efficiency had just blown his cover. Frank took a step closer, studying George's face with new intensity. "You know, now that I really look at you, take away the baseball cap and sunglasses." His eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Oh my God, you're him. You're actually George Strait." George pulled off his cap and sunglasses, no longer seeing any point in the charade. "Yes, Frank, I'm George Strait. And this house we've been walking through? This is where I grew up. Those previous owners you've been insulting all morning, those were my parents." Frank's face went through a series of rapid color changes, from red to white to green, as the full impact of his morning's behavior hit him. "Your parents, but I thought, the records show the owners were John and Doris Strait, but I never imagined that the farm boy who went off to the army and never came back might have actually made something of himself." George's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "That the simple farming family you've been dismissing as worthless might have raised someone you've heard of?" Frank stumbled backward, nearly falling off the porch steps. "Mr. Strait, sir, I had no idea. If I had known who you were, I never would have." "Would have what, Frank? Treated my family's belongings with respect? Shown some basic human decency when discussing people's lives?" George stepped closer, and Frank instinctively backed away. "Or would you have just been a different kind of phony, kissing up to a celebrity instead of showing your true character?" I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any disrespect. Frank's phone started ringing, and he glanced at it with panic in his eyes. "It's my broker. The news is probably already spreading. What do I do?" George looked at the terrified realtor and felt a mixture of anger and pity. Frank Porter was a small man who'd been caught being his worst self in front of someone who could destroy his career with a single phone call. But George had bigger concerns than teaching manners to a rude real estate agent. "Answer your phone, Frank. Tell your broker that George Strait is buying his childhood home for the full asking price, cash, and that you'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. Can you handle that?" Frank nodded frantically and answered his phone, his voice shaking as he relayed the information. George could hear excited shouting from the other end of the line, and he knew that within hours news trucks would be lining the road outside his family's old home. As Frank finished his call, George heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. His heart sank as he saw a familiar black SUV, followed by 2 news vans, turning onto the property. His manager had found him, and apparently he'd brought company. "George!" His manager, Rick Martinez, jumped out of the SUV before it had fully stopped. "What the hell is going on? Your attorney called about buying a house. Then I get calls from 3 news outlets asking about rumors that you've disappeared to your hometown. Do you have any idea what kind of chaos this is causing?" Behind Rick, camera crews were already setting up equipment, while reporters checked their appearance in phone cameras. George watched the circus beginning to unfold around his childhood sanctuary and felt a deep sadness at how quickly his private moment of discovery had become a public spectacle. "Rick, I need you to keep those reporters back," George said quietly. "This is private property and I don't want them on it." "Private property? George, this is just some random house in the middle of nowhere. Why are you—" Rick stopped mid-sentence as he really looked at the farmhouse for the first time. "Wait, this is where you grew up, isn't it?" George nodded, and Rick's expression immediately shifted from frustrated manager to concerned friend. They'd known each other for over 20 years, and Rick understood better than most how rarely George opened up about his past or his family. "What's really going on here, George? And don't give me some line about wanting to buy real estate. You've got that look in your eyes like when you're writing a song about something that really matters." Before George could answer, one of the reporters had approached close enough to shout questions. "Mr. Strait, can you confirm that you're purchasing your childhood home? Is this connected to your recent cancelled appearances? Are you planning to retire?" George ignored the questions, but he could see more vehicles approaching in the distance. Word was spreading fast, and soon this quiet country road would be overrun with media, fans, and curiosity seekers. He needed to act quickly if he was going to protect his family's secrets and his grandfather's legacy. "Frank," George called to the realtor, who was still standing in stunned silence. "I need you to listen carefully. I want you to go to your office right now and prepare the closing documents. Have them ready to sign by tomorrow morning, and I want the deed transferred immediately. Can you make that happen?" Frank nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. Whatever you need." "Good." "And Frank?" George's voice carried a warning. "My family's privacy is important to me. I trust that our conversation today about my parents and their belongings will remain confidential." Frank swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Strait. You have my word." As Frank hurried to his car, George turned to Rick. "I need you to rent every room in every motel within 50 miles of here. I don't want reporters staying overnight in this area. And hire security, good security, to patrol this property 24/7. Rick's eyebrows shot up. "George, what exactly are you protecting here? This level of security for a house purchase is—" "Just do it, Rick. Please. I'll explain everything later, but right now I need to trust that you'll help me handle this my way." Rick studied his friend's face and saw something there that made him nod without further argument. "Okay, but George, there's something you should know. The news about you being here is already on social media. I've got calls from Nashville, Los Angeles, even New York. Everyone wants to know what the king of country is doing buying his childhood home in secret." George looked back at the house where his grandfather's stolen songs lay hidden behind a kitchen wall, where evidence of a 70-year-old industry conspiracy waited to be revealed to the world. The story was already bigger than he could contain, but he still had control over how it unfolded. "Set up a press conference," George said suddenly, "tomorrow afternoon, after I've closed on the house, right here on the property." "A press conference? George, you haven't done an unscheduled press conference in 15 years. What are you planning to say?" George was quiet for a long moment, watching as more news vans arrived and reporters set up their cameras along the property line. Somewhere out there, a 74-year-old woman named Eleanor Henderson might be watching this coverage, not knowing that her long-lost brother was about to change both their lives forever. "I'm going to tell the truth, Rick, about my family, about this house, and about some things that happened in the music industry a long time ago that people need to know about." Rick looked alarmed. "George, you're talking like someone who's about to burn bridges with some very powerful people. Are you sure you want to do that?" "Sometimes bridges need to be burned," George replied, "especially when they were built on lies in the first place." The first reporter had managed to get close enough to hear part of their conversation, and George could see her frantically texting on her phone. Within minutes, speculation about George Strait planning some kind of industry exposé would be spreading across entertainment news outlets. George's phone buzzed with a text from his record label president. "Call me immediately. What the hell is happening in Texas?" Then another from his publicist. "Damage control needed ASAP. Reporters asking about family secrets and industry revelations. What should I tell them?" And a third from his longtime friend and fellow country star. "Brother, whatever you're doing down there, you've got the whole town talking. Hope you know what you're getting into." George turned off his phone and looked at Rick. "I need you to do something else for me. Find the best genealogist and private investigator money can hire. I'm looking for someone named Eleanor Henderson, probably living in the Nashville area, about 74 years old. She may not know her original name was Eleanor McKinney." "McKinney? But your family name is—" "There's a lot you don't know yet, Rick, but you will. Tomorrow, when I tell the world about my grandfather, Samuel McKinney, and what was done to him." Rick stared at his friend with growing concern. "George, you're scaring me. Whatever you've discovered here, maybe we should think about this before you do something that can't be undone." George looked back at the house one more time, thinking about his grandfather's journal entries describing the fear and heartbreak of a simple man who'd trusted the wrong people. He thought about his sister Eleanor, growing up without knowing she had a family who never stopped looking for her. He thought about all the stolen songs that had made other people rich and famous while his grandfather died in obscurity. Some things can't be undone, Rick, but some wrongs can still be made right, even after 70 years. As the sun began to set over the Texas countryside, casting long shadows across the property where George Strait had learned to play guitar and dream of stardom, the boy who'd left home to serve his country was finally ready to serve his family. Tomorrow, he would stand before the world's media and reveal secrets that would shake the foundation of country music history. But tonight, he had one more task to complete. Under cover of darkness, away from the cameras and reporters, he needed to retrieve his grandfather's manuscripts and prepare to give Samuel McKinney the recognition that had been stolen from him so many decades ago. The King of Country was about to abdicate his throne long enough to become something more important, a grandson seeking justice for a family legacy that powerful men had tried to bury forever. 24 hours later, George stood on the front porch of his childhood home, looking out at a sea of cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers that stretched down the country road as far as he could see. News trucks from major networks lined both sides of the street, and satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers reaching for the sun. The quiet farmhouse that had harbored family secrets for 7 decades was now the center of the entertainment world's attention. Rick had outdone himself with the logistics. A small stage had been erected in the front yard, complete with a podium and professional sound system. Security guards formed a perimeter around the property, keeping the crowd at a respectful distance while allowing the media clear sightlines for their cameras. Local police had been called in to manage traffic, and the mayor of Poteet had declared it the biggest event in the town's history. George wore his best black suit and his favorite white cowboy hat, the same outfit he'd worn to accept his last Country Music Association award. But today felt more important than any award ceremony. Today, he was going to give his grandfather, Samuel McKinney, the recognition that had been stolen from him. In his jacket pocket, carefully preserved in protective sleeves, were photocopies of the original manuscripts and journal entries. The originals were safely locked in a bank vault in San Antonio, along with legal documentation that George's attorney had prepared overnight. His legal team had worked through the night to research the copyright implications of his grandfather's stolen songs, and what they'd found was staggering. 5 minutes, George, Rick whispered, approaching from behind. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once you step up to that podium, there's no going back. George nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. Any word from the investigators about Eleanor? Rick's expression brightened slightly. Actually, yes. They found her. Eleanor Henderson, 74 years old, retired music teacher living in Nashville. George, you're not going to believe this. She's been following your career for decades, has every one of your albums, been to dozens of your concerts. The investigators said when they approached her yesterday about possible family connections, she started crying before they even finished explaining why they were there. George felt his knees go weak. His sister had been there all along, in Nashville, in the heart of country music, following his career without knowing they were family. The irony was almost too much to bear. Where is she now? George asked. She's here, Rick said quietly. She drove down from Nashville last night. She's been sitting in a car at the back of the crowd for the past hour, too nervous to come forward. She doesn't want to intrude, but she desperately wants to meet you. George's eyes scanned the crowd until he spotted a modest blue sedan parked at the edge of the gathering. Through the windshield, he could just make out the silhouette of an elderly woman with silver hair, sitting alone and watching the proceedings with obvious emotion. After the press conference, George said, his voice thick with emotion, I want to meet her away from all this chaos. Can you arrange that? Already done. The local church pastor offered his office for a private meeting. No cameras, no reporters, just family. George took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The crowd immediately quieted, hundreds of camera shutters clicking in rapid succession as the King of Country prepared to address the world. Ladies and gentlemen, George began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, thank you for coming to Poteet, Texas, to the house where I grew up. I know many of you are wondering why I've called this press conference, why I've purchased my childhood home, and what secrets I've alluded to discovering here. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, reporters with notebooks ready, camera operators focused on his every movement, fans holding homemade signs declaring their love for his music. 2 days ago, I came here as a 72-year-old man feeling disconnected from his roots. I found something in this house that has changed not only my understanding of my own family, but my perspective on the entire country music industry that has been so good to me throughout my career. George reached into his pocket and pulled out the photocopied manuscript of Your Cheatin' Heart. This is a song that many of you know well. It's considered one of the greatest country classics ever written, but the man whose name appears as the composer on the recorded version is not the man who actually wrote it. A murmur rippled through the crowd as reporters leaned forward, sensing something significant was about to be revealed. This song, along with dozens of others that became country music standards, was written by my grandfather, Samuel McKinney. Not Samuel Strait, as I knew him growing up, but Samuel McKinney, a name my family was forced to abandon when we fled Nashville in 1948. George went on to tell his grandfather's story, reading excerpts from the journal that detailed the systematic theft of songs by powerful music industry figures. He explained how his family had been forced to change their name and flee to Texas, how his sister had been given up for adoption in the chaos, how his grandfather's life's work had been stolen and credited to others. The evidence I found in this house proves that some of the most beloved songs in country music history were stolen from a simple Texas farmer who trusted the wrong people. Songs that made millions of dollars for recording artists, publishers, and record labels, money that should have supported my grandfather's family and allowed him to continue creating the music he loved. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. George could see reporters frantically taking notes and camera operators zooming in for close-ups of the documents he was displaying. I'm not here today to destroy anyone's legacy or to take away from the artists who recorded these songs in good faith, believing they were legitimate compositions. But I am here to ensure that my grandfather, Samuel McKinney, gets the recognition he deserves, and that the truth about this systematic theft is finally brought to light. George announced that he was donating all of his grandfather's original compositions to the Country Music Hall of Fame, where they would be preserved and displayed as part of a new exhibit about the forgotten songwriters who helped build the genre. He also revealed his intention to establish a legal fund to help other families who might have similar stories of musical theft and industry exploitation. Finally, George said, his voice growing emotional, I want to announce that my search for the truth about my family has led to the discovery that I have a sister I never knew existed. Eleanor Henderson, if you're listening, I want you to know that our parents never stopped looking for you, never stopped loving you, and that you have a brother who would very much like to meet you. The crowd erupted in questions and camera flashes, but George stepped back from the podium without taking any questions. He'd said what he needed to say, and now he had more important business to attend to. An hour later, George sat in the quiet office of Petite Methodist Church, across from a woman who shared his eyes, his stubborn jawline, and his gentle smile. Eleanor Henderson looked exactly like their mother had at the same age, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same warm Texas accent, despite decades of living in Tennessee. I always felt like something was missing, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her cheeks. When I was a child, I used to have dreams about a little boy who looked like me, but I could never remember the details when I woke up. And when I heard your music for the first time, there was something about it that felt like home, even though I'd never been to Texas. George reached across the small table and took her hands in his. Our parents named you Eleanor McKinney. You were born in Nashville in 1949, 2 years before me. They gave you to a family called the Hendersons when they had to run from some dangerous people, but they never intended for it to be permanent. Eleanor nodded, pulling a worn photograph from her purse. It was the same image George had found in the attic, their parents standing on the front porch with a young Eleanor between them. The Hendersons gave me this when I turned 18, she said. They told me I was adopted, but that my birth parents had loved me very much. I've carried it with me every day since then, wondering who those people were and if they ever thought about me. They thought about you every day, George assured her. Dad's letter said they spent decades searching for you. They hired investigators, contacted agencies, reached out to every Henderson they could find. You were never forgotten, Eleanor. You were always loved. They talked for hours, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of 7 decades apart. Eleanor told George about her life as a music teacher, how she'd never married, but had dedicated herself to nurturing young musical talent. George told her about his career, his own family, and the emptiness he'd felt despite all his success, an emptiness that now made perfect sense. I want you to know, George said as the afternoon sun slanted through the church windows, that you're not just getting a brother back, you're getting a whole family. My children, my grandchildren, they're going to be so excited to meet their Aunt Eleanor. Eleanor smiled through her tears. And I want you to know that every time I heard one of your songs on the radio, something in my heart told me I was supposed to be proud. Now, I understand why. As the sun set over Petite, Texas, George and Eleanor stood together on the front porch of their childhood home, watching the last of the news crews pack up their equipment. The circus was moving on, but the family reunion was just beginning. George had accomplished everything he'd set out to do. His grandfather's legacy would be preserved and honored. His sister was back in his life where she belonged, The truth about the music industry's dark past was now public knowledge, and changes would come because of it. But more importantly, George Strait had discovered that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't found in mansions or bank accounts, or even on concert stages. Sometimes they're hidden behind loose floorboards in the house where you grew up, waiting for you to come home and find them. The king of country had returned to his roots and found something more precious than any crown. He'd found his family, his history, and his grandfather's stolen dream finally brought into the light. Samuel McKinney's songs would be heard again, this time with his name proudly attached, and the circle that had been broken 70 years ago was finally complete. As George and Eleanor walked into the farmhouse together, George realized that this was the ending his grandfather's story had always deserved. Not just justice, but family reunited and love restored across the generations. The house that had kept their secrets for so long was now ready to become a home again, filled with the laughter and music of the McKinney family, finally whole after 7 decades apart.